have been involved there. We also know, for example, that Cuba continues to host a pretty substantial collection intelligence sites on behalf of the Chinese and the Russians. But you look at the region and you look at all of these leftist Marxist terrorist organizations, all of them in many cases got their seed money from the Cubans. Mr. Secretary, if I can move on. I noticed you did not answer my question, because my question specifically related to whether there was new evidence to support that conclusion. I can just tell you. Why would I need new evidence? Because you're claiming that they're a state-sponsored terrorism, suggesting they're ongoingly involved in that.
If you want to see a sitting cabinet secretary take the absolute beating of a lifetime on the congressional floor, you need to watch Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen completely undress Secretary of State Marco Rubio. During one of the most explosive sessions of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee ever caught on camera, Senator Van Hollen bypassed all standard legislative pleasantries to launch a scorched earth, high-retention broadside against the entire executive foreign policy apparatus. Van Hollen didn't just nitpick at agency budgets, he laid out a sweeping, multi-layered indictment that connected skyrocketing domestic energy prices directly to military blunders, before trapping the nation's top diplomat on hidden intelligence maneuvers. In a relentless, fast-paced sequence, Van Hollen left the secretary with absolutely nowhere to hide, exposing a massive gulf between White House victory claims and the reality of global instability. Let's look directly at the jaw-dropping moments this routine briefing transformed into an absolute battlefield over executive accountability.
Van Hollen, you're next.
Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. This is your first public hearing since President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu launched an illegal war against Iran. Netanyahu said he's been waiting 40 years to do this. Turns out he finally found a president who was both stupid and reckless enough to join him. The war has killed 14 American service members, wounded hundreds more, and killed thousands of civilians. It's driving up the price of gas, food, and much more. Trump obviously doesn't care. He called high gas prices peanuts and said, "I don't think about Americans' financial situation." That's from the President of the United States. And all for what? The President told us 91 days ago that we had, quote, won the war in Iran. Last year, he told the country, Iran's key enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Was that false? Let's face it, Mr. Secretary, the Trump foreign policy has become a dumpster fire. This is the same president who's more interested in flattering Vladimir Putin than in protecting Ukrainian sovereignty. The president who lifted restrictions on the transfer of sophisticated U.S. chips to China, but came back from his trip there with nothing but ballroom envy. He tweeted about that the other day. This is the president who brought on Elon Musk to take a chainsaw to AID, which has enabled the current Ebola outbreak in the DRC. We've also witnessed corrupt crypto deals with the UAE royal family that have enriched the Trump family at the expense of our national security. We've seen an administration engage in extrajudicial killings in the Caribbean, hijack Venezuelan oil, threaten to invade Greenland, and weaken the NATO alliance. Here at home, a Reagan-appointed judge said that you and former Secretary Noem abused your powers when you locked up and still seek to deport students for protesting the destruction of Gaza. The Reagan-appointed judge said you did that, quote, primarily on account of their First Amendment-protected political speech. Speaking of Gaza, the so-called Board of Peace seems to have run around. Meanwhile, while Senator Rubio once proclaimed that the U.S. must, quote, work to ensure that refugees who flee war, torture, and persecution are provided safe environments to live and thrive in. Now, as Secretary of State in this administration, you have capped refugees at a record low of 17,500, and white South Africans, Afrikaners, have comprised roughly 99% of those slots, Mr. Secretary. A race-based refugee system. At the same time, the president's preventing Cuban political refugees from entering the United States, even as you've imposed a near oil blockade on that repressive regime. The stated goal is to change the government there, but the only real change is humanitarian crisis inflicted on millions of people, not members of the regime. And in that regard, Mr. Secretary, I have a question for you regarding the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. On the very first week, at least, of this administration, the administration reinstated that. And in a recent January 26 EO, you made statements suggesting connections to Hezbollah and Hamas. The previous administration did a thorough review with the intelligence community and concluded that there was no evidence that Cuba was engaged in ongoing state sponsor of terrorism. Did you find new evidence to support that conclusion?
Well, first of all, let me just say that's your question, but you made this long statement of which I disagree with most of it. We won't have time to address every point that you made. So let's stick to Cuba specific, because that's the question that you asked. Cuba has sponsored terrorism, and it's been supported groups. For example, virtually every left-wing, radical, violent terrorist group in the Western Hemisphere has at some point relied on support from Cuba. The ELN, the FARC dissidents, including them, have been involved there. We also know, for example, that Cuba continues to host a pretty substantial collection, intelligence sites on behalf of the Chinese and the Russians. But you look at the region and you look at all of these leftist Marxist terrorist organizations, all of them, in many cases,
Mr.
got their
Secretary,
seed money
if I
from
can
the
move
Cubans.
on. I noticed you did not answer my question, because my question specifically related to whether there was new evidence to support that conclusion. I can just tell you.
Why would I need new evidence?
Because you're claiming that they're a state sponsor of terrorism, suggesting they're ongoingly involved in that. My final question to you, Mr. Secretary, relates to the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex. There have been reports that the United States is working with Israel to take away the Kingdom of Jordan's custodianship over the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex in East Jerusalem. Can you confirm today that there's no truth?
I'm not even aware of those reports.
There are reports, so I was hoping you could confirm.
Is that like a media report, or?
There have been several media reports.
Well, you know the media is always accurate.
No, they're not, and that's why I'm getting.
Yeah, no, I've never even
So
heard that.
if
That's
you
the
could
first time I even hear anybody discuss that.
All right, well, I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Secretary.
But we have a great relationship with Jordan, and we're very helpful. So I've just never heard that before. You should, I don't know what article you're referring to, just give it to me, I'll look at it.
I'm happy to.
Is it a credible website? or?
I'm glad to hear you say, Mr. Secretary, there's no truth.
I've never heard that discussed by
Thank you.
anybody.
The confrontation ignited instantly when Senator Van Hollen took the microphone and condemned the administration's decision to launch what he termed an illegal, destabilizing conflict alongside foreign leadership. Van Hollen delivered a blistering verbal strike, declaring that while international leaders had been waiting decades to provoke this conflict, they finally found an American executive reckless enough to join them. He laid out the devastating human and economic toll of the conflict, pointing directly to the loss of American service members, thousands of civilian casualties, and the economic chaos hitting regular citizens in the form of soaring fuel and food costs. Van Hollen ruthlessly highlighted the absolute hypocrisy of the executive branch, quoting the president's dismissive remarks about domestic financial struggles while pointing out a massive contradiction. The administration claimed months ago that the conflict was completely won and the adversary's nuclear capabilities totally obliterated, yet multi-billion-dollar costs continued to pile up daily. Labeling the entire apparatus an absolute dumpster fire, Van Hollen marched through a laundry list of global failures, from slashing critical African humanitarian aid to engaging in legally suspect naval operations in the Caribbean and threatening territorial expansion. The hearing reached an absolute climax when Van Hollen focused his target squarely on Secretary Rubio's direct oversight of human rights and regional classifications, shifting from broad policy to precise administrative traps. Van Hollen exposed a stunning shift in Rubio's own ideological history, calling him out for capping global refugees at an all-time low of just 17,500. While engineering an overwhelmingly race-based entry system that completely favored specific populations over political refugees escaping repressive regimes close to home. Van Hollen then dropped a massive prosecutorial hammer regarding the administration's sudden decision to redesignate Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, citing an executive order that alleged active ties to global militant networks. Van Hollen reminded the Secretary that a rigorous, exhaustive review by the intelligence community had previously concluded there was absolutely zero evidence of ongoing state-sponsored terror activity from the island nation. He looked Rubio dead in the eye and demanded to know what specific new evidence the department had uncovered to justify overturning the collective consensus of American intelligence. Faced with a direct trap, Secretary Rubio completely buckled, entirely failing to provide a single piece of fresh intelligence or newly documented evidence to support his department's sweeping classification. Rubio attempted a massive defensive redirection, dismissing the senator's extensive structural critique as a political statement before retreating into a generic history lesson about Cold War-era Marxist groups and foreign intelligence tracking sites. Van Hollen immediately re-engaged, cutting through the crosstalk to explicitly state on the congressional record that the Secretary of State had flatly failed to answer the question because no new evidence actually existed. In the final, high-tension moments of his turn, Van Hollen dropped another crucial inquiry regarding reports of secret U.S. coordination to strip long-standing diplomatic custodianships over sacred sites in East Jerusalem. A visibly rattled Rubio claimed total ignorance of the situation, attempting to mock the validity of the reporting entirely. Van Hollen closed the trap with complete composure, forcing the secretary to publicly distance the administration from the controversial reports before yielding his time, capping off an absolute masterclass in legislative oversight that left the State Department's credibility completely shattered. Senator Chris Van Hollen provided an unforgettable blueprint for holding the highest levels of the executive branch accountable to the absolute limits of law and intelligence. When a lawmaker completely strips away administrative bravado to reveal that major international designations and military engagements are built on political posturing rather than verified facts, it fundamentally changes the nature of constitutional check and balance. What do you think about Chris Van Hollen completely cornering the Secretary of State over these shifting intelligence metrics? Do you believe Van Hollen successfully exposed a reckless and deeply inconsistent foreign policy agenda? Or do you think Rubio's aggressive regional strategies are a necessary deployment of American strength? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. This clash over global security and administrative honesty is a massive conversation, and your perspective matters. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our breaking coverage of these high-stakes Capitol Hill showdowns.